wait for the recording to start. There we go. Hello everyone, thank you and welcome to the final session. Very exciting. Edge effects and Borderlands. We have three speakers for this session today, Simon, Caroline and Rod, and we're going to everyone's going to speak in that order, the order that's on the conference programme. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction for each speaker when they come on and speak and things like that. And then we will save the questions until the end, until we can get a bit of a round discussion of things like that through there. We'll see how we're going on with time and things like that. But if you start to hear, that means we're running out of time. But we'll go through with it like that. So the first person to speak, and when you get to the Q&A, if you can post your questions in the chat after everybody's spoken, that way we don't miss them. If you post it now, then lots of people might post things and we'll miss it, so wait until the three speakers have spoken. So we'll start off with Simon. Simon, are you ready? Are you with us?
Yeah.
Yes. Cool, grand. So I'll give you a minute to start putting up your screen. So just to say hello. We haven't actually met before, but hello, nice to meet you. Simon Ryle is an associate professor at the University of Split, Croatia. His research focuses on underworld poetics, animal structures and early modern literary infrastructures. His first monograph on Shakespeare was published by Palgrave Macmillan, and his research has appeared in a really big range of volumes and journals. If we had more time, I'd read out the list, but a lot of them you can find out about that later on if you want. And today he's going to talk to us about violent borders and rhizome infiltrations, seaweeds, mutant flows, and fascist micro-assemblages in 2666. So, thank you very much, and over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Ian. Okay, so this paper is going to talk about 2666, Roberto Bolaño's novel, and violent borders in that novel, as well as counter-violent and border-subverting aspects of water and the subaqueous in the novel. This paper is kind of all over the place just because Bolaño's writing is too. It's about flow, fascism and the fantastical, Mexico, mass murder and micro-assemblages, NAFTA, non-linearity and neoliberalism, sexual violence, supermanagers and seaweed. I think this paper is quite different from a lot of the papers that I've seen presented at the conference, and I was feeling a little bit uneasy about that. So I think with interdisciplinary conferences, there's always a risk of speaking up to the border of shared languages. So I'm really hoping that at least some communication happens today, right now. Part one is about femicidal assemblages. The dark center of Bolaño's novel is the fictional Mexico city Santa Teresa. With Santa Teresa, Bolaño forges a poetics of the systemized, actual and ongoing sexual violence and murder that has afflicted the most vulnerable women of the border city, Ciudad Juarez, since the 1991 North American Free Trade Agreement. In part four of the novel, Bolaño offers forensic and relentless description of the hundreds of murders, rapes and sexual mutilations suffered by the factory women whose corpses are abandoned in the slum areas surrounding the macula that produce North American consumer items. For the Mexican journalist Sergio González Rodriguez, the murdered maquiladora women are inseparable from the neo-Fordist free trade that has rendered Juarez a factory city for the production of US goods. The femicide machine is centered on a fundamental asymmetry of flows. One of the busiest borders in the world, 42 million people crossed between the US and Mexico at Juarez in 1996, for example. The trans-border situation of the town involves a radical realignment of economies and social ecologies. Flows of workers and raw materials meet at the US-Mexican border. Laborers from southern Mexico and Central America continually flow north in search of work at the macula. Up to 300 newcomers arrive in the town per day, lending Santa Teresa a transitory air, in Bolaño's words, such that it resembled an enormous camp of gypsies or refugees ready to pick up and move on at the slightest prompting. quite a lot of the papers have mentioned loss and the need to preserve loss, and the level of cultural loss is kind of like several stages deeper or more or darker in Bolano's telling in Santa Teresa. The raw materials worked upon in those factories, on the other hand, arrive from the north, which is where the final products also return to. 84.5% of Mexican exports are to the USA. The unequal flow of capital in Juarez is accompanied by strategic reterritorializations of the city's urban geography. Ultra-wealthy areas replete with luxurious shopping centers, gated communities, careful landscaping, extensive surveillance security, and electrified fencing, in stark contrast with slum communities located around the factories. The wager of this paper is that certain philosophical concepts can help us understand this strange new world that modernity is making for us. And so I'm referring quite a lot to Deleuze and Guattari. They have a concept, the assemblage, which is something which plugs into what they call strata and creates flows. NAFTA is an example of an assemblage that leads to a radical recoding of the bodies of the most vulnerable by an exploitative system of manufacturing and profit extraction, the creation of vast inequalities, which is sustained by this violent border. I'm thinking of Rhys Jones's work on violent borders in using that term. The erosion of all codes and norms of social life and society, etc., etc. The Juarez maquiladoras offer a uniquely grotesque neoliberal outcome, but they also supply a mirror of the vulnerable and exploited of our contemporary world. The pattern of resource inequality and asymmetrical flows is replicated worldwide. The richest 80 people in the world own more than the poorest 50%. 25% of the world is obese or overweight. 25% is starving. Part 2, supermanagers and micro-fascists.
Simon, sorry, just very briefly, we can't see your slides advancing or you, if there's something wrong there.
What can't you see?
We can't see your slides advancing and we can't see you.
Oh, what can you see?
Just the front page of your PowerPoint.
Oh, it's working for me. That's strange.
You're in the edit mode, not the slideshow mode.
Right, let's try again. How does that look now?
Excellent. That's right. Yeah, that's
working. That's working.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know what I did differently, but I did do something differently. Good. All right, part 2, supermanagers and micro-fascist flows. Supermanager, Spinoza's question, why is it that the masses stubbornly fight for their servitude as though it were their liberation, was revisited in the 1970s in Deleuze and Guattari's attempts to understand the molecular flows of desire that undergird authoritarian hard-right politics. And this took renewed significance in 2016 when 53% of white women voted, seemingly against their own interests, for the serial misogynist and pussy grabber in chief that was the previous US president. For Ajay Singh Chowdhury and Raphael Chapp, the rise of the supermanagerial class is at the center of this historical reemergence. During the first 5 years of the Nazi Reich, there was a sharp rise in the pay of the managerial elite, the top 0.1% of German society. From just under 4% in 1930, their share of the national income under the new Nazi order would nearly double by the eve of World War II. Paralleling and in many cases vastly exceeding the rise of the supermanagerial Reich, as Thomas Piketty details, the CEOs of neoliberalism have received pay rises and bonuses out of all proportion to their employees' stagnating pay. Adjusting for inflation, the pay for US workers has stagnated at over the last 50 years, whilst CEO pay has increased by 1,000%. Why did supermanagers flourish during Nazism, and what does this parallel with neoliberalism mean? The rapid phase of privatization during mid-1930s Nazi Germany, the decrease in small businesses and increase in monopolies and cartels, quite contrary to mainstream trends across Europe, demonstrates the diffuse system of Führerprinzip, whereby autonomous leaders of industry were encouraged to function as pioneers of the national spirit in whatever sector they worked. Likewise, in key sectors such as pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, media and entertainment, and the financial sectors of neoliberal economies, market power is concentrated in the hands of a few companies whose management structure is invariably headed by a supermanagerial elite. In Deleuzean terminology, The supermanagerial class forms an assemblage that connects up and codes molecular flows of individualized desires. The masses certainly do not passively submit to power, Deleuze and Guattari write, nor do they want to be repressed in a kind of masochistic hysteria, nor are they tricked by an ideological lure. Desire is never separable from complex assemblages that necessarily tie into molecular levels, from microformations already shaping postures, attitudes, perceptions, expectations, and semiotic systems. In considering the dehumanizing neoliberal flows of Santa Teresa in 2666, this paper turns to the novel's other center, which is, I hope somebody's read this novel, otherwise I'm kind of speaking into the void, I guess. The elusive anti-hero Hans Reiter, who goes by the pen name as part of his writing career, Archimboldi. Embodying what Herbert Marcuse terms the great refusal, Hans lives external to the fascism of his contemporaries. As a boy and a soldier, he is a mystery and a misfit. He moved across the surface of the earth like a novice diver along the seafloor, his subaqueous movement and desire constituting something like the mutant flows that for Deleuze and Guattari offer a line of flight from microfascisms. A mutant flow always implies something tending to elude or escape the codes they write. By contrast, the supermanagerial class plugs or seals the line of flight. Mutant flows seek the liberation of desire, and gathering flows, the machinic assemblage of the supermanagerial society, brings the flows under the dominance of a single flow capable of overcoding them. That's the war that's taking place here between a kind of top-down imposition of order from a powerful elite to something more anarchic, which is bottoms up. This overcoding Bolano calls semblance and writes at one point in the novel, National Socialism is semblance. The machinic assemblage of the Nazi supermanagerial class and the way Bolano positions Archimboldi as a figure of mutation are perhaps most vividly presented in 2666 with Hans's murder of Leo Sammer. During the war, Sammer is the assistant director of a firm tasked with supplying labor to the Reich. Located in a grim Polish town just beyond the German territory, during the freezing first months of 1945, Sammer mistakenly receives a trainload of 500 Jews from Greece. Troubled by the bureaucratic inefficiency, he receives an order from the Office of Jewish Affairs in Warsaw to dispose of them. It comes amidst a flurry of other paperwork, a memorandum on the need to increase production of milk and a suspected theft of potatoes. Like Eichmann in miniature, Sammer is Bolano's image of the banality of evil. He bemoans the way it isn't in his nature to be tough and organizes the murder of the Jews in batches of 10. Interned in an American prison of war camp at the end of the war, Sammer confesses his story to Hans, seemingly without any sense of the magnitude of his crime. When Hans learns that the Americans are really only after war criminals of a certain prestige and not likely to even prosecute Sammer, he strangles his fellow prisoner. We learn later that Hans has killed nobody in all his time as an infantryman, despite his seeming indifference to the danger of combat. After the murder, Hans changes his name to Archimboldi in order to evade retribution. His choice of pseudonym is linked to the way the painting of Giuseppe Archimboldo, Hans thinks, brings about the end of semblance. So we've got this kind of Archimboldo versus Nazism being set up here. Like the stylistics of a certain mode of art can resist a top-down version of tyrannical, totalitarian social organization. More than mere pragmatism, the change in his name to Archimboldi as a writer accompanies his becoming a writer who likewise targets semblance, so that killing Sammer becomes something like what Jacques Lacan terms the passage à l'acte, a radical action that fundamentally realigns the symbolic orientations of his life. After crimes like Sammer's, the seafloor is for Hans no longer sufficient escape. It's impossible to poetize after Auschwitz, as Adorno writes, but it's continually necessary to write against the social assemblage that made the death camps possible. If his aversion to violence in the heart of combat expresses his opposition to micro and macro fascisms, the act of murdering Sammer forges a mutant flow that allows him to resist semblance. And this is part 3. This is like the last little bit. Seaweed poetics. Like Hans becoming Archimboldi, the nonlinear spatio-temporal movements of Bolano's writing constitute mutant flows that seek an alternative to what Mark Fisher has termed capitalist reality. After moving to Mexico in 1968, Bolano became active in left-wing political causes. This period of utopian dreaming drew from and can be compared with Herbert Marcuse's contemporary sense that art is vital in building a new sensibility of liberation and resistance to capitalist production. Reality has to be discovered and projected. The senses must learn not to see things anymore in the medium of that law and order which has formed them. The bad functionalism which organizes our sensibility must be smashed. In attempting to explore how Bolano's fragmented and watery writing constitutes a mutant flow that rejects micro-fascist assemblages, I focus on Hans's fascination with seaweed. It's been remarked that with Archimboldi, Bolano creates a writer who's outside of tradition, unmarked by borders, we could say. In arranging for the young Hans to have nearly no contact with education or reading except for his only book, which is The Plants and Animals of the European Coastal Region, Bolano also binds Archimboldi's exteriority to the sea. He's outside borders because he is always with the sea. As a boy, Hans's formative experiences center on water. Unwilling to rise from the bottom of his bath as a baby, indistinguishable from seaweed as a boy, in some strange physical way, he's bound to the seabed. Can a boy and seaweed have anything in common, asks a befuddled German tourist who saves Hans from drowning after mistaking him for a tangle of seaweed. The most powerful moments of Hans's life involve immersion. When Hans Reiter saw a seaweed forest for the first time, he was so moved that he began to cry underwater. After the war, Archimboldi comes to understand that his previous subaqueous identity is over. The seaweed boy was dead. However, by titling Archimboldi's fifth novel Bifurcaria bifurcata, the taxonomic name for brown forking seaweeds, Bolano suggests that the death of the seaweed boy has transformed seaweed into an aesthetic principle. As with the principles of rhizome theory that characterize Deleuze and Guattari's writing, Bolano's non-linear writing resists the hierarchies of conventional narration. Just as seaweed is spread by means of rhizomes, meaning that their growth may be broken, shattered at a given spot, but will start up again on one of its old lines, so too Bolano's irrational spatio-temporal movements proceed like a life in exile along multiple non-hierarchical lines. As Deleuze and Guattari describe rhizomic writing, another way of traveling and moving, proceeding from the middle, through the middle, coming and going rather than starting and finishing, going from one thing to the other and back again, but a perpendicular direction, a transversal movement. Just as the branching fronds of seaweed makes its growth rhizome-like, so too in the continual interruptions to describe books, murals, dreams, and its vast cast of tangential characters, Bolano's narrative renders the novel's movements in terms of transversal bifurcations. How are we for time? I can stop there if that's enough.
You've got a couple more minutes if you want.
I've got one more paragraph. I can read this. It is just difficult for anyone who's not read the novel, and it's such a big novel that I'm anxious about that. To summarize and to exemplify this, take Hans's discovery of the character Ansky. Ansky never appears in the novel except as a diary, which Hans finds behind a fireplace in an abandoned cottage in Ukraine in the winter of 1941. A very lengthy digression detailing Ansky's life follows. The murder of Sama supplies the passage al act by which Hans becomes Archimboldi. Ansky's diary shows how writing makes possible mutant flow. Hans is at first enchanted by the secret hiding place behind the fireplace, which seems both to link and differentiate the diary's hiddenness from the underwater realms he fantasizes. Vitally, with Ansky's diary, the secret hiddenness is aligned with a writing that represents a continual mutation towards that which is exterior, communism, futurism, and finally, Ansky's friend Ivanov's fiction of a young boy wounded on a battlefield. This is a fiction inside a fiction, hidden behind a fireplace. And it's about two young boys healed and transported to America by extraterrestrials, so that the constant orientation of Ansky's diary towards alterity via the fantastic, the overseas, the refugee, and the destitute aligns the potential of writing with mutant flow. Only Ansky's wandering wasn't semblance, Hans thinks. Ansky's wandering, his non-linear writing, his tangential relation to the novel that Bolano is writing, is another version of Archimboldi's aesthetic. The series of bifurcations culminates in the reappearance of the extraterrestrials right at the end of Ansky's diary, each of which is described as very thin, a very tall creature, more like a strand of seaweed than a human being. So the seaweed is popping up all over the place, but in a very non-linear manner. In discovering the seaweed potential of a writing at once rhizomatic and subterranean, writing is a continual advance into exteriority, which culminates in a repurposing of his own undersea impulses. The mutant flow that leads to the murder of Sama becomes suddenly possible. Ansky's seaweed extraterrestrials allegorize and exemplify the mutant flows of Bolano's seaweed poetics and that is a resistance to or a refusal of violent borders. That's, I guess that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. If you could, there we go. Fantastic, wonderful. And yes, absolutely. Some really kind of interesting things there about the kind of transitions and things like that. And seaweed, you've come to the right place to talk about seaweed, UHI. I just saying you that I seem to spend the first half of this week talking about algae with people at SAMS. So yes, it's very much a seaweed orientated place. It's wonderful. Okay, thank you. So we'll pause that and we'll come back to questions, as I say, when everybody else has spoken. Caroline, do you want to bring up your PowerPoint slides and we'll get started with you?
Yep.
Okay, so just to a very brief introduction, everybody. Caroline Deer is an artist based in Skye whose work explores our evolving cultural engagement with the land and the natural world. She teaches on the HNC Contemporary Art Practice and MPA Art and Design at West Highland College UHI in Portree. And the title of her talk today is Along the Verge, Engagement, Edge Effect and Entanglement. So if you're ready, if you're sharing your screen, then we'll just let you carry on.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Yeah, my name's Caroline Deer. I live and work on Skye, and my work's I'm interested in how we engage with the land and how that changes over time. So I've been looking at the verge for a while, and I did this for the MA, and I've been looking at it, developing the thoughts I had there. So there's three things I'm going to look at, three different aspects today. So one is ecological, one is the metaphorical, and another is the creative. So if we start, and then I've just put this in because it gives me a lot of pleasure. Often you find really interesting conjunctions and different things happening on the verge, which just, so ecological. So Richard Mabey in 2013, well, previous to that, but he was coined as saying Britain's largest unofficial nature reserve. So he's talked about the verge quite a bit, and he's looked at the verge, and Plant Life have also been the UK-wide charity, and they've been looking at the verge, and they've been looking at trying to get statistics and figures for this. And basically there's a lot of the verge, it represents lots, over 50% of all the flora of the UK is found somewhere in the verge. Verges represent really good habitats. They, if I get a quote from Darwin, and this is related to
Caroline, sorry.
Yeah.
Your slideshow stuck again. Do you want to kind of actually play the slideshow? Because we're on the edit screen.
Oh, that's interesting. Thanks for letting me know, because again, it's so I'll escape. Will I just go play? Oh, so can you see which slide do you see there?
I think I see one later on. If you just, it should just, this doesn't actually look like PowerPoint actually. I think if you just press play, because we seem to be in an edit screen at the moment.
Yeah, no, I did press play, but actually what I'll do, this is, it's not PowerPoint, it's Keynote, but I've got it in PowerPoint, if that would make any difference, I don't know.
It'll be dual screens that's causing the problem. So the slideshow is actually appearing on another screen. So what you've shared is the edit mode of of Keynote rather than the actual slideshow itself. So it'll be just what you've shared.
I thought I shared the slideshow.
if you share screen instead of window, it worked. That's what I did, I think, to fix the
Yeah,
problem.
no, that's, I'll go out of it and try again. Don't know why that came up. Okay, so I haven't got it now. Oh, because I've closed it. Okay, I'm going to have to do that. Now, this did work yesterday. Well, now I've got to open it again because I've closed it to get out. Sorry about this, folks. Okay. And please let me know if
it doesn't show in a sec,
yeah.
I think start talking and we'll see if Joe
Okay.
can throw it up on screen.
Yeah, because I moved them on quite quickly. So if I put in play now. So can you see that full screen?
We're back to the edit mode. We're back to the edit mode.
You can't see that full screen?
No, no.
Oh, okay. Right, I'll escape.
So I think if Joe's maybe got something that could maybe go up, then that's probably the way to do that.
Okay.
Yep, I'll do that. Just give me a sec.
Yeah, excellent.
There
Thanks.
we go. Excellent.
Yeah,
Right.
just prompt me, Caroline, to.
Yeah, I'll just say next because
Okay.
it's quite quick. Yeah. Okay, so next. Is it not working for you either?
It does seem to be moving, but maybe quite slowly. Has it?
Yeah, it's gone on. So you can move on a couple of more slides. So that's the ecological I was talking about. Next, metaphorical, and next, that's the creative. And so if we look at the next, and that was the interesting conjunctions. Next. So this is Richard Maybe's quote, Britain's largest unofficial nature reserve. And it's basically the value of this space ecologically. Next. So the verge is it's a linear series of habitats, and it's a linear edge because we've put the roads in, it exists, and it's useful because it's an unmanaged wilderness or cultivated wilderness, or there's various different things. So Darwin likened the complexity and diversity of the natural world to an entangled bank where even as a constant physical environment, natural selection forever leads to an evolutionary change as individuals battle to beat predators, parasites, and social competitors. And the verge can be, this is almost like a definition of edge effect. And edge effect is being defined as an ecological concept which describes the phenomenon at the boundary of two different habitats. And it's between two different ecosystems along this edge where there's more species, the biodiversity is much richer, and it's because you've got the different habitats, so they're all competing, and that's why verges are so good. And the edge effect is enhanced in small fragments of land. Next. So these are really one of the reasons why verges are very good for wildlife and plants. But they're also a cultural relic. They hold the plants that used to exist in the land around them, partly because the landscape management isn't, they're just left to be, and partly, so they're kind of historical references. I noticed that some of the text has gone off. Anyway, so this is from Plant Life, a quote, basically saying many verges are effectively fragments of ancient hay meadows and grasslands, white with oxeye daisies, yellow with buttercups and yellow rattle. That's just what I've got in the picture. Next. So Plant Life have been doing research in the UK. They've had a road verge project running for a while, and they have found out that there's 24,000 square kilometres of road verge in Britain. So that's 313 lots of land, which is almost equivalent to the amount of rough meadow that exists in Britain. It's one of the reasons why, you know, it's an important bit of land. It's also the way it's maintained in different areas. It's got different, allowing small plants, maybe, but sort of mowed quite early or whatever. So there's also, well, there was a study even in 1970, not that long after the M1 was built, between London and Leeds, looking at the verges along there, and 384 species of vegetation, including lots of unusual plants which weren't originally planted there, were found. Next. So even on Skye, where we think of the landscape as being quite, well, it's all managed obviously, but the upland hay meadow habitat is one of the UK endangered priority habitats for the UK, and it's on the Biodiversity Action Plan. And that habitat includes, well, actually, the Nature Scot says in Scotland, most examples are small patches on the roadside, the road verges. So plants in that habitat include like the melancholy thistle on the right and various different orchids. There is actually butterfly orchids in there, but you can't really see them, as well as globe flower, yellow rattle, lots of other plants like that. And these verges are often, you know, they're rich in these plants, whereas the rest of the landscape has become poorer. So next, please. So another term that I've been looking at is plant blindness. And this was a term which was defined in 1999 by two American biologists. And their original definition had 4 elements: an inability to notice or see plants in the environment, a failure to recognize the importance of plants in the biosphere and in human affairs, a failure to see or pay attention to plants in one's own daily life, and an anthropocentric ranking of plants as inferior to animals. So we've been just continually unaware of the importance of plants in our lives and in all around us. And so part of these projects that I've been doing is trying to encourage people to see the plants around them more and to value them. So next. So I've been doing a series of walks along the verge with all different groups of people, all different times of year, different types of roads. We've chosen quite single track, quiet roads or unused tracks. But basically, just looking at what we find, you don't normally get very far. We've used hand lenses, we've touched and tasted and smelt and told stories about the different plants. So just depending on what plants you come across and what the knowledge in the group is. And those have been really successful, and I've been gathering words and different feedback from people from that, which I might talk about later. Next. So it's not just in rural areas that these are important. So in cities, urban flora is really important. So look at the space that this plant has got to grow in. It's got tarmac right up to the base of that tree and the road right about it, and yet it's flowering. Valerian, and I think there's dandelion, and there's a few other things in there. Next. So I think in COVID times, in lockdown, this is when the verge came to its fore in a way, and people became very aware of the importance of these edge spaces. So Sophie Le Goulle, who's a French botanist and living in London, she was inspired by a project in France. So since 2017, the use of pesticides in public spaces has been forbidden in France. except in cemeteries and sports ground. And this has meant that local authorities there in villages and places, they've all had to find other solutions to embrace their weed problem. And gradually people have begun to value them and see that they've got a use, not just as they reduce atmospheric pollution and reduce flood risk, but they also help reconnect people with nature. So there was the botanists in London and other places started writing the names in chalk on the pavement of the different plants that were around, trying to raise awareness of these city plants. And she set up the website More Than Plants, which is now running with lots of these projects. Next. So a similar chalk on the verge. This was spotted in Ullapool. And what I really liked about this, well, there's several things, but I like the way with such a simple little quote, thinking about your litter on the verge, it joins up with the sea and the sea joins the whole world. And so this was done by a group from Ullapool called the Ullapool Sea Savers. So they're a charity, a marine conservation charity, which has been set up by kids and run by kids. So this also relates to George Monbiot's quote, society is like an amoeba, it moves from the margins, not the centre. I think somebody earlier today mentioned that, and I thought, oh yes, and it's sort of how we move society on, how we change things, and where you look at things from. So next, please. So the next slide is thinking about the scale, thinking about larger scale and how opportunities, political opportunities come up. So this was the verge, as if you want, of the line of the Cold War, or it's now the green belt. It's called the European Green Belt. So this is in the 1970s, satellite images showed, old growth forest in the Finnish-Russian border. In the 1980s, biologists discovered these rare birds in the Bavaria Thuringia area, somewhere down there, which were no longer anywhere else in Central Europe. And in the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War and the borders coming down, suddenly there was this no man's land, which actually people didn't realize, different countries didn't actually know who owned it. But because it had had all those years of the wildlife being allowed to move in and nobody interfering, it was really recognized as this rich wildlife corridor. And so very quickly it was set up with 24 different countries and over 12,000 kilometers. And it's been set up as a green route, a cycle route, walking route through all these different landscapes. But it's an example of how things can happen if the political will is there. But, if you tried to do that now, I don't think that would happen. Next. We can also see the verge as a place of interconnections and intersections in a wider way, more abstract way, between different disciplines, between different cultures, between different people, thinking of what it kind of represents as this thing of connecting people, connecting things. And it's always that edge which is the most creative. Joining, just combining with different people who think slightly differently, have got a different background, and then you can see that fertile edge of creation. Next. So if we're thinking of what are we looking at when we look at the verge? So in the center, and I'm thinking, what is it about the verge? So in the center, we've got the entangled bank that Darwin was mentioning, the entangled grasses on the surface and plants, and they're intermingling, which is kind of our scale. And on the left, we've got the mycelial network underground. So it's not the root network, because the plant roots only go so far, but the fungi, the mycelial fungi, they connect up all the different roots, and they pass chemicals across the roots to the plants, and they link up everything basically. And on the right, we've got an image of the neural network in our brains. And it's just thinking how things go across, how things move across in our brains, how we make connections, how some connections stay alive. But it's also why we're so connected to nature, because basically all these networks are the same images, same way that things move around. Next. And I've also got a couple of quotes thinking about that, our deep connection with nature. Timothy Morton: no being, construct, or object can exist independently from the ecological entanglement. That's from the ecological thought. And earlier from 1911, we've got John Muir: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So this is thinking about our emotional connection to nature. And when I was looking at doing this work with the verge, I talked to a few people who'd really used the physical verge itself as a mode of recovery from mental and physical illness. And one person used the verge to walk a little bit further each day, as well as mentally stimulating their brain with identifying the different plants and counting them, getting their brain to work again after a car accident. The other person used the verge they were looking for specific plants in specific locations, and they visited those, and it made them get out, and they gradually got to feel better and recover. But something about the verge being so accessible, and it wasn't sort of having to go out into the, it was really there and able to help. So next. So last year with lockdown, I did a series of walks each week over 12 weeks, just walking along my verge really close to my house. And I picked a small bunch of flowers each week. And I've made a book, and I've got the Latin, English and Gallic names, the Sky Gallic. And then I've paired each week with a particular concept which relates to the verge. So some of those is things I've mentioned, like edge effect and things. But for example, week 8 is commons, and we can think of the verge as a commons relic, like I mentioned earlier. And I'll just read what I put in the book. The concept derives from when land was held and managed in common. This communal working gave an innate understanding of the land as something which was handed from the past and given on to the future generations. In the Highlands of Scotland, the verge was managed communally within recent living memory, each household managing one section, scything it as needed. The common grazings, a fundamental part of the crofting landscape throughout the Highlands, is now a declining form of communal land management. So it's just sort of highlighting different aspects of next, the verge, whoops, and thinking that, for instance, on Skye, the verge used to be called the Long Park until, because you'd graze your animals along it. But of course, now that doesn't happen much anymore. So we've come to the creative element of the verge. So because it is this commons, it is this common neutral space, people feel creative, they can be creative, and they are really creative in it. So this is a blessings box, well, 2 different blessings box. It's basically a food bank, but it's a food bank that's put on the verge in fairly innocuous places, so it's just not very obvious. Without common land, no social system can survive. This is from Christopher Alexander, and he was looking at the bombed out cities of Amsterdam and London after the war and thinking about spaces where children could play. Next. So these roadside structures have been flourishing, and on the left we've got egg boxes or food. We've got political opinion. You've got advertising for your B&B. You've got repurposing existing structures, such as a telephone box. This is the library, And then that was the bus stop that I showed you earlier, which is in Unst. And it was a schoolboy who started to decorate it. And this is a film screening for Mark Commode and his mother. Next. So there's also a lot of humour, which people can comes out in the Verge. So we've got on the left, we've got a plastic ram, and on the right, a plastic horse. And the horse is used as a protest against a proposed airport. Next. So eggs as an exchange box started, I think it's a fairly recent phenomenon on Sky, say 5-10 years. And these have flourished, and people build lots of exotic things, and everybody does their own thing, and I think it's great. Next. And it also, there's other people who've started to take this up. So there's, this is on the left, a small shop, which is basically a shed, but you leave your money. It's painted boys are for sale. And on the right is an arts organisation doing a plant exchange and a seed exchange. Next. So this is the evolving Verge. So this is my local bus stop, which is used for advertising. The egg box has got bigger, and it's now become a croft box, and it's got lots of cakes and soap and all sorts of things in it. That's the neighbours do. Next. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was these stickers that appeared on the bus stop. It says Bitcoin, freedom, no bank or state lies. And it really amused me that Bitcoin should be, which is a totally virtual currency, should be advertised in a rural bus stop with a sticker. Next. So stickers have been started to be noticed as well at certain hotspots around. So I don't know if it's to people traveling to certain spaces, and then they say they've been there, like lots of them are in different foreign languages. So this is the road to Applecross. You can't even see the sign anymore. And this is the Quirang. And maybe, yeah, it's a phenomenon. So it's just continually evolving. Next. So as I mentioned last year in the Verge, so this is Peter Liversidge in April 2020. He lives in London. He's an artist, and he's known for his text works. So he was getting very frustrated and wanted to do something. So he did some text signs on cardboard and stuck them on the railings near his house. And as we all know, this went viral. So it's interesting thinking about how the Verge can interact like that. Next. So as I mentioned earlier from the walks, I've been gathering words from people in different formats. So that these were the first words I gathered, and then I kind of put them together in sort of poems. The most recent one I did was an online workshop with Plant Life, and I got people to put words in the chat, and then I made a poem from that. So next. And I'm gathering, I'm sort of gathering words which relate to the Verge and developing a thesaurus or something like that. So it's just interesting, the multitude of different ways of seeing the same space, because I've got some technical things like soft estate, which is how the roads department define and lots of different things. So, okay, next. I just like you to enjoy your own Verge and notice how it changes, and encouraging you to go out and about and see things. And then the next slide is all my references. So that's everything. I hope that's okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. That's great. Wonderful. Thank you. Really interesting, and yeah, fascinating for me. I'm fascinated by driveways and footpaths in city spaces and how they kind of merge into each other and things like that. And yeah, I'm surrounded by verges all the way through, and seeing connections between what you've been talking about and what Simon's been talking about as well. So already got a question formulated for later on. It's excellent. Grand, thank you. So Rod, are you still there? Hopefully. If you want to stop, if you want to turn your camera off, Caroline, and Rod, if you want to turn yours on.
Yep. I will just just see if I can start sharing.
Yep. So we'll just give you a sec to start your PowerPoint, and maybe when you've got it on screen, maybe advance it forward one slide just so we can make sure it's working. So it's kind of, that would be a good thing.
There's a bit of a delay, so.
Yeah, it happens. Right. Are we almost there? If you can't get it to work, Jo can do it from her end as well. Now you're on mute. Still muted. You're still muted, Rod. Hold on. I can't unmute you.
It is coming, just very slowly. What I'll do is I'll switch off my camera.
I tell you what, is it probably easier if we get Jo to put it up, because Jo's probably got a better connection. Can you do that, Jo?
I can do that, but I wouldn't guarantee I have a better internet connection.
Okay, right. Okay, so
I think it is coming. It's just a bit slow. I've switched off my camera, so that should help.
There we go. Right.
I'll let you try it, Rod, and if it doesn't work, I'll come in.
Don't turn your camera off, Frank, because all we're seeing is you. Nope, not appearing.
It's still coming. Just 2 seconds.
Right, there we go. There we go. Do you want to click it forward one slide just so we know it works? There we go, and click it back. Okay, right. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so for our last speaker, Dr. Rod Lovie, congratulations, by the way, is based at the Centre for Mountain Studies in Perth and has been researching the connections between community perceptions of landscape, how this influences opinions on change, and how this can be integrated into development planning. And his research has a particular emphasis on the A9, another little interest of mine. And so today he's going to be talking to us about conceptualizing landscape as an edge effect. So there you go. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ian. Just like to say it like Abdi, Fiskarma, good afternoon. And I was going to say thanks to Raggy for putting me on last. I hope it means that we're saving the best to last, but we'll see as we go. I think the talk we're going to give complements the two that we've already had, and it's quite a mixed bag. So essentially, what am I looking at? Well, an ecotone or an edge effect, as I'm sure you've done this morning, is an ecological concept which explains that as the edges of two adjacent ecosystems overlap, here a land zone and an aquatic zone, there is a transition zone where there is greater diversity. And I'm using this concept of ecotone or edge effect as a metaphor for the transition zone between space and place. So what is landscape? Well, I like the term landscape because everybody thinks they know what it is until they have to define it. In English, the word landscape is often used to mean the scenic, aesthetic, or purely visual qualities of land. However, the word has its origin in the German Landschaft, in Dutch Landskap, and Old Norse Landskap, where it also meant an area which its inhabitants knew closely. In these interpretations of the term, landscape is not merely scenery, but the active local setting for inhabitants' lives and practices. When the concept of landscape entered the English language, it included both meanings. However, this has changed and subtly evolved to emphasize the aesthetics of scenery. This was due to the concept of a peoples-centred meaning perhaps being at odds with the English monarchy or court's understanding of claims about land, as well as Italian linguistic and cultural influences promoting the aesthetic values of landscape, particularly in painting. However, landscape is more than just scenery. In his essay, The Beholding Eye, Menig explores landscape through an analysis of the complexities of the human relation to it. He considers how the landscape is composed of competing views. To do this, he took a bunch of participants up to the top of a hill and asked them to look at a landscape and then turn round and write down what they had saw, and got completely different answers from everybody. And said that there are those who look out upon that variegated scene and see landscape as perhaps nature, as habitat, as artifact, a system, a problem, as wealth, as an ideology, as history, as a place, or as an aesthetic. Landscape then has powerful physical, environmental, economic, cultural, psychological, and aesthetic components. And as Menig says, any landscape is composed not only of what lies before our eyes, but what lies within our heads. So if landscape is created inside us rather than outside us, is there an authentic perspective of landscape? Although perceptions of physical landscape elements can be used to positively represent a local identity, this identity can be used to exclude other residents who are not considered a part of the local community. If the environment and physical surroundings are understood to be fixed, then it is easier to construct a community identity that also appears constant and unchanging. However, this approach to understanding landscape and people can be fraught with problems if it leads to a regressive, essentialist view which regards the community as exclusive and others as strangers. Essentialist here means that it contains attributes within itself that are fixed, appropriate, and unquestionable, and therefore these attributes are comprehended as essential to its very nature or character. Alternatively, if the environment is understood as constantly changing, it can be easier to construct a shared social identity which is similarly regarded as adaptive. Here, change is understood rather than feared. How landscape is represented in paintings or imagery can be similarly fixed or essentialist, and can lead to other landscape visions being ignored or regarded as less important. The image of the Highland landscape was an essential element in the Victorian rebranding of the Highlands. An example of this is the painting Monarch of the Glen by Edwin Landseer, which shows a majestic stag overseeing its Highland kingdom. This image is used to portray the Highlands as an area of natural, wild, untamed, uninhabited beauty. However, regarding these landscape qualities as the essence of the area means aspects like previous habitation, historic issues, land ownership and management, and even the people can be ignored. The artwork Monarch of the Clearances is an attempt to promote an alternative viewpoint. This can be understood as a pictorial representation of questioning the preconceptions of the essence of a place, in this case by highlighting how the assumed untamed, uninhabited beauty came about. But if landscape is place or placial more than spatial, then for a while it led me trying to explain the differences in the concepts of landscape and sense of place as separate concepts. As shown here in the sense of place wheel, the different aspects that make up sense of place include things like landscape, like landmarks, touch, taste, smell, boundaries, cultural icons. And the landscape wheel, the landscape in the middle, contains similar aspects of smells, touch, feel, sounds, landform, geology, land use, settlement. And for a while it created some difficulty in me trying to differentiate between the two. And I was sort of really glad when I was at a conference and I spoke to a professor from Sweden and asked him for some advice and trying to justify the differences between sense of place and landscape. And he just looked at me and said, "Why on earth would you want to do that?" And I think, well, I wish more advice like that would be sort of useful. So Tuan, the geographer, in 1977, differentiated between two aspects of how humans engage with their environment, space and place. Here, space is an emotionally neutral component, while place is constructed through meanings allocated to it. From this perspective, landscape combines place and space because the perceptions of the observer or inhabitant give it meaning, and I'd argue occupies that transition space between, or transition area between space and place, that edge effect that is occupied by aspects of sense of place. Because landscape, being a physical place, encompasses both elements as an edge effect. So how we conceive of landscape? Well, academic research has moved towards exploring landscape as an embodied way of knowing and engaging with the local environment. This dwelling perspective, or relational aspect, recognises that landscape is created through the relationality between space and meaning. Here, landscape is not a simple binary relationship between man and nature, constructed by the laying of meanings over physical space, but instead created through living in it. The landscape becomes a part of us, just as we are a part of it. This concept moves the relationship between people and their landscape from a building perspective, where human meanings are imposed or built on the natural space, to a dwelling perspective, where any act of building is already fashioned and impacted by the individual already inhabiting or dwelling in the space. This theoretical stance is a rejection of Cartesian thinking that separates the observer from the observed, separates the individual from their environment. Therefore, the relationality between space and meaning is regarded as the aspect that fundamentally exists, because it is these relations that create place. As a way of explaining this relational perspective, Wiley uses the example of a landscape painter. The painter creates a landscape painting, but also the landscape in front of them has created the elements within the painter in order to enable them to paint the landscape in the first place. Landscape, says Wiley, in other words, is the creative tension of self and world. This approach attempts to reunite people and landscape by conceiving landscape as an ongoing story. The changing landscape is a memory of and a memorial to all who have lived in it, and to perceive the landscape is to pay tribute to this story. Therefore, landscape can be considered a form of natural commons, both ecologically and historically, of which human life is part of, rather than being separated from. My PhD thesis involved adopting a relational approach to landscape to research the dualling of the A9 from Perth to Inverness, and was an opportunity to engage with the residents about their landscape perceptions and how these change. I worked with local participants and used photo elicitation to explore and elicit their landscape, their place, and the meanings attached to it. With photo elicitation, participants take photographs to provide details of their physical landscape, their space. And in a subsequent interview, the meanings are elicited in order to generate their concepts of place. So using photographs along the A9, well, there was obviously lots of opportunities to get in images of what we might think of as sort of classically landscape, and to discuss why these were important to the individuals. But as well as that, there was those locations that might look more mundane, but are important, essential, meaningful, and ascribed with emotions for the contributors. Now, photo elicitation allowed the results to be analysed because the photographs were containing the link to both the physical element in the photograph and the meaning that was discussed in the interview. So the relationships between the physical element and the meaning could be plotted together. And I was interested in what was in the sort of top left there. I was interested in transport because although I was looking at everything, I was interested in the E9. And here, roads and transport infrastructure seemed mainly to be associated with historic or heritage meanings and historical physical aspects in the landscape. Before I sort of ran the analysis, I was actually expecting the sort of transport element in the photographs to be more in the centre, along with sort of built-up areas and maybe cultural aspects. But doing the analysis this way allowed me to go back and look at the interviews, and people were discussing issues about the history of the A9. So the A9 is more than just a physical road connecting communities. It connects communities to their past and to their landscape. And the development of the A9 over the past 400 years has been a reflection of the changes that have been experienced by the Highlands and by wider Scotland. National events such as the Jacobite rebellions and the Wades Road, the rise of the Sporting Estate, World War I and the requirement to create jobs fit for heroes meant the building and improvements of the A9. Discovery of oil off Scotland's shores meant that the A9 was upgraded so the revenue and jobs could continue to move south. These were catalysts for major upgrades to the road. At the same time, the road itself is emblematic of the story of much of Scotland over that time, connecting Highland and Lowland, the urbanised central belt with the rural north, and connecting Scotland's rural economy through time, from droving to tourism to oil, city expansion. The road itself can be regarded as crucial in the continuing development of how Scotland perceives itself, whether that perception is of scenic wildness, industrialised modernity, or both. It's really up to the viewer. Improved road access to urban areas was recognised to alter the sense of place and lead to the earlier state being desirable. However, those meanings attached to landscape are not fixed and can be altered by proposals for landscape development, in this case, the dualling of the A9. So my research also involved a change workshop with local participants, looking at how sensitive these landscape meanings were to potential change and development. So while roads and transport infrastructure had been mainly associated with historic or heritage meanings, and that's where we've got in the when we looked at the results from the change workshops, they actually came about that potential changes to transport infrastructure were not regarded as a threat to these meanings. You can see there circled in blue the sensitivity of meanings of past, and blue was considered quite low when it came to the change element, the road. Instead, the possible impacts of the road development on the natural environment and community cohesion were considered to be more significant. It's circled there in purple. The potential sensitivity of the people's connection to the land and natural environment was seen as a highly sensitive to the change from the A9. So this demonstrates that communities need to express their perceptions in relation to specific developments rather than just in the early developmental planning stages. And so therefore community members' landscape perceptions should not be regarded as buried deposits of knowledge waiting to be unearthed and kept aside and to help inform future planning decisions. Instead, landscape perceptions should be regarded as a snapshot of the ever-changing relationship between the community and their local environment. Understanding how these perceptions change can assist both community and planning professionals to collectively plan future infrastructure development. And as I'm saying here, contradictions then between the professional perspective of the more objective way of looking at landscape with the community perspective where their perceptions of where they live are more subjective, could be celebrated. Because this allows us to avoid the essentialist or seemingly authentic vision and instead celebrate the contradictions in landscape, in place, in community. So while professional planners would seek to get earlier involvement and get that knowledge in early in the planning process, however, as we saw from the change workshop, these perceptions are actually altered by the proposed development. So if they're gathered in too soon, they're actually of little use. Instead, landscape research could be seen as continual, could be seen as an attempt at co-creation between the community and between planning professionals. The research process is an interface or an edge effect. So thank you for that, and I'll stop sharing the slides.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rod. Wonderful. Right, so if I could ask the three speakers to turn on your cameras so we can see you all and see you kind of, and that's something we can kind of start thinking about, sort of talking through there. I love the idea of perceptual landscape. It made me think of this, there was this, as a sentence in Johnson's Journey to the Hebrides where he talks about, before me on either side were high hills, which by hindering the eye from ranging, force the mind to find entertainment elsewhere, because he's so kind of caught up in the idea of the picturesque. These bloody mountains are getting in the way of the view and things like that. So it's kind of going through there. There's a lot here about transitional space and a lot about the kind of the idea of borders and things like that, creating division in a sense, whether it is the neoliberal right kind of creating a dichotomy of an us and them in order to exert power by making the us exerting power upon the them, and the things you're talking about in terms of the kind of the verge space. I thought that what was really interesting there was the fact that it retains the memory of the flora that was there before. And the way that you're talking about the kind of the idea of an authentic landscape and this kind of this way that the kind of the this kind of a difference between a perception and the kind of the actuality, the way that's kind of divided through. And all three of you are talking in a sense about fuzzy transitions, about a fuzzy transition between sort of something through there. But you're also talking about with the rhizomes, the roots, the mycelial network underneath and things like that, and the kind of the underlying things. So an odd question to end the conference on the edge to ask, but the edge, the border, thinking of rainbows, and everybody focuses on the difference of the colours within the rainbow, but actually the rainbow continues in both directions. We can't see it, but we know it's there. And thinking about moving beyond the kind of, this is for everybody, moving beyond this kind of this space where things cross over, how far does it extend beyond that? And is there actually sort of, you were mentioning, Caroline, about this idea of the reconnecting with nature. I know Mandy's going to, we always say this, we were never not connected with nature. We are part of nature, and the idea of us being separate is part of this imposition of a border, of an edge, whereas actually what you're all saying is kind of the way that the edges are fuzzy, they bleed through, and it's all the kind of one thing. Does that make sense? Does somebody want to respond to that? Maybe with microphone on.
I'll just jump in for a few moments. I'm just going to say, yeah, we are all connected. That's the whole point. And our civilization has almost wanted to take us further and further away. But actually, we're so dependent on everything and for our lives and stuff. But we are made up of that. Yeah, and there isn't, the whole point about edges is there isn't an edge, because the closer you look, say at the verge, the little tiny plants that grow into the tarmac, and then you've got the lichen and mosses growing into the tarmac on one side, and then on the other side you've got things growing through the fence, and they might not be able to, the sheep might not be able to. So, you know, just practically speaking, in that edge, you know, where does that edge end? So yeah, I'll stop. I'm sure the others have got more.
Yeah, maybe just to sort of take on from that, and I really like Caroline's sort of point that, that, you know, as we look closer, the edge sort of grows. We never actually get to the edge. There's always something sort of more there. And I was thinking from a sort of landscape perspective, there was I think again sort of Wiley was arguing that sort of landscape sort of research is sort of most useful when it occupies a place where it unsettles, where it questions preconceptions. So actually you're using that sort of thing to almost like say, yeah, we've got to, you know, look closer at these maybe edges that we've constructed, and are they actually there when we sort of look closer at them? And I thought that was a sort of really sort of a point that you picked up there, Ian, that connected all three of the presentations.
I could just say we are all connected, of course, but sometimes we forget that we're connected, or we get diverted by political flows sometimes that are greater than us, or not even visible to us. So we need strategies to remember that connection, or to get reconnected if we have started living in a way which didn't recognize that, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there's one of the things people are talking about, the climate crisis and the mutagenic crisis and things like that. One of the things is the actual existence of borders and nation states is one of the things that's kind of creating that process, and kind of that they're losing that connection through there. I think there was Frank posted in the discussion about the kind of things, particularly for you, Rod, about, you're talking about the difference between kind of professional views and people who are members of the community, but what about people who are both? What does that then tell us about that kind of sort of process?
I think that's a really good point, and it's, when I was doing my research, I first started off by saying, you know, I want, you know, I'm part of the community. You want to be in there. We're looking at sort of how to sort of achieve that, and then it doesn't take long before you realise, even when you're trying to sort of represent the community, you're actually still outside it. So you've got maybe a foot in both camps. But what I found really interesting was how we're used to considering a community as being made up of separate elements in it. You know, it's not just one homogenous lump of people. But when I was involved in speaking to planners, developers, landscape architects, etc., you realise just how we get used to thinking of the council as a homogeneous lump, but actually their professionals are built up, you know, the professional sphere is built up of these sort of lots of different people and thoughts and approaches, and so how we've got to, as you're saying, as researchers, maybe we've got one foot in both camp, we've got that ambiguity, but we've actually got to think about how we interact with either and both. But that's a really good point, about that that Frank raised, that I continually find myself having issues with, especially now that I'm working for the council, and I've sort of spent a lot of my life railing against decisions by it. So it's a unique experience for me just now.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Mandy kind of, I don't know if that's a question or just a comment about the idea of all edges are really zones. I think that's kind of really sort of interesting in the way that kind of sort of, I think that ties in perhaps, Simon, with some of the things that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about, and this idea of the kind of the Santa Teresa as Santa Teresa in 1666. It's not really a border town, it's more like a zone. It's like an interzone, isn't it? It's kind of the idea that it's not fully in Mexico and it's not fully in the States, which is the thing I was talking about, this kind of the way it expands. It's actually because there isn't actually a division, but it's being imposed, and that's causing the harm and things like that. And this idea of kind of an edge as a zone, anybody want to kind of pick up on that? Or are you all puzzled? We could ask Mandy what she meant. This kind of, Mandy, what do you want to explain what you meant by that? Oh, Simon can't turn his mic on, Joe.
Can you try
We'll
this?
get back to that.
Yeah, it works now. It was because I got like logged out briefly.
I have enabled Mandy's mic now. Try again, Mandy.
No, it's just almost a sort of fractal comment that what my experience, certainly looking at the shoreline in particular, is that it's not a line at all, and as soon as you start looking at it, it's a big wide area, and even at any one moment the shore is not really a line, and it feels as though actually pretty much most lines that we look at, if we look at them closely enough, we realize actually they're porous, and there's lots of interesting complex things going on at them, and yeah, that was all.
Sorry, I'll let Simon. Okay, so I was going to say, just from that point, Mandy, and I'm sure you've sort of looked into it, the idea of edge and as zones in sort of permaculture thinking, and about how trying to maximise the edge zone, which gives you greater opportunities, sort of grounded in design, and about how they sort of consider different. As you're saying, the edge as a zone could either be almost like slowly moving from one zone to another, like a wetland, or is it a cliff? Is it just along and then the new one starts and you've got less opportunities for sort of connections between the two, and creating that new zone in the edge? I thought that might be useful.
Yeah, and I'm thinking there's sorry, I'd let Simon jump back in, so we keep interrupting you, Simon.
Well, my zones are not really like these nice zones, like the shoreline and the marshland. These are zones which have been created, and they're being created increasing rate at the time. At the moment, there's 60 border wall projects around the globe, which are designed to stop certain classes of people from moving from one zone to another. So they're creating a zone of a certain class of people, but capital is allowed to flow in and out of those territories. And so those people who work, if they work in those zones, their labour is the surplus value of their labour is flowing across, but they're not able to follow it. And so these zones create extractive economies, so they benefit those on the beneficiary end of extractive economies. And so I think it is connected. It's a similar concept. I mean, we can abstract enough using people like Deleuze and Guattari to make the connection, but it's also the politics involved makes it something darker. That's why I'm not connecting in a little. I'd rather think about the sea, I think, and marshland, really.
Absolutely, yeah, There's the kind of the capital can move, but people can't. It's kind of a really sort of, that's what I mean about the kind of the idea of nation states are very new anyway. It's kind of we've managed for thousands of years without those kind of things, but it's kind of that things were there. I suppose it kind of the question that Jean posed, or a comment about the ambiguity of the edge of the universe. Is there an edge, and if so, what lies beyond? One of the contemporary philosophers I'm looking at, Marcus Gabriel, writes about the fact that the universe doesn't actually contain everything. The universe only contains the world of science and of physics and things like that, and that for it actually to appear and exist, it needs to appear within something in order for it to exist and things like that. So the universe isn't everything. So the universe does have an edge because there are things that the universe does not contain, such as unicorns. unicorns are not contained in the universe, but they exist, and things like that through there. So again, it's this kind of this perceptual sort of idea through there, and the way of kind of existing in that through there. And one of the things that made me think of, I don't know if anybody's done anything with phenomenology and the idea of being in the world, and about again this kind of you're not viewing the system, you're part of the system, and you're viewing from within. I think it's what you mentioned, Simon, kind of coming from the middle. It's like you're actually within the system, so your worldview is because you are part of the world, rather than this kind of this separation that's kind of come through that. I don't know if that's kind of some sparks of anything through there. So you might be going to comment, Caroline, but you're just thinking.
Yeah, people talk about Renaissance perspective, vanishing point perspective, which creates this view as if you view the world through a window. That's an important concept, and so various philosophers link that to the development of subjectivity, which perceives itself as separated from the world. So maybe there's a kind of aesthetics which can work against that or reverse that, and so maybe non-linear writing is an attempt. I think in Bolano, I think it's self-consciously so to try to work out a way of writing which doesn't lend itself to that kind of isolated subjectivity. Why the sea is so important. It's an immersion which Hans, writer, or Archimboldi is so important for him to not be a part of a kind of totalitarian regime, but to be underwater where there are no borders and there is tangible connection with the substance of the world.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And actually, all those things are going on at the same time, and it relates to Frank Rennie's things about the layers in the land. So all of that is happening. It's all happening at the same time, and that fragmented. So it's a different way of perceiving the world. And we've had a tendency to make sense of it by getting rid of stuff and looking at one line, but actually everything is entangled, and it's sort of how we cope with that, and how different ways of seeing it. So I think it's really important.
Yes, exactly. What as Frank just said, where does one sea end and another begin? That's the kind of really kind of interesting. Where does the A9 end and begin? There's kind of it's a bit controversial and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of really interesting. Just because we've got a couple of minutes left, I just wanted to jump because Ian Robertson had a comment about edges in the form of boundaries between crofting townships, common grazing, and deer forest. The significance of those, and I think it's when you were talking, Caroline, I was thinking of enclosure, and you as well, Rob, mentioned sort of the pre-enclosure sort of again this kind of the way in which it's an economic imposition enclosure on common land, which I think is the kind of the levelers and the kind of English of the sort of Wars of the Three Kingdoms building through there. So do you want to say something about kind of common land enclosure and that kind of sense, and those kind of things as kind of the way that kind of changes our perception of landscape, position and things?
Is that me or Frank?
I think it's anybody.
I think it's really important because it's such a different way of thinking about the land, and it's to do with it's just being engaged with it in such it's not such a financially strict thing that there's so much has to be got out of so much bit of land. If it's equal, or it's not necessarily equal but shared, and the management, there's just a very different conception of it. And it happened a long time ago in England, and there was huge battles against it. A really, really big thing, I think. Yeah.
The sort of from that, but the idea of sort of common ownership. One of the my participants was interviewing about, not about this, but when it kind of came up, and they were speaking about how they used to walk a lot up in one of the glens that was sort of a particular estate, and the land there wasn't particularly managed and just left, and everybody would walk up it. And then change in landowner meant that the estate was being worked, more fences were going up, and it was just sort of gradually changing, and how they felt so different about the area because it had physically changed, the landscape of it had changed, and it changed their sense of ownership to that landscape. Even though they had no ownership of it, they felt that they had, and almost that was destroyed by the reality of sort of land ownership, as it were. And I found that particularly interesting about how we can have a sort of a perceptual common, that we sort of feel that we have, the community feels it has a collective ownership on a landscape, where it actually physically doesn't because of sort of legislation or land ownership.
Absolutely.
I thought that would get Frank. I thought that would get Frank.
Yeah, we're just one at a time, so I think we'll maybe just kind of hand over to Michael in a minute. But yeah, I'm thinking of all kinds of things, and even like if seaweed is fascinating, because of course it's not a plant, as any algal scientist will tell you. That seaweed, the algae are that transition space between land and sea, but they're not plants. And they're these alien kind of interlopers that sit in their own kind of little thing, and they feed through. And I think algae and fungi are kind of really, really, really interesting in that kind of way through there. So is it a very quick point, Frank, or is it kind of something more complex?
No, it's something to think about afterwards. If you're familiar with Bruce Chatwin's book on songlines, there's a wonderful bit in songlines where he's sitting with an Aboriginal in a Jeep, in a Land Rover, and he drives across and intersects the man's songline, and he begins to sing the songline about describing the landscape they're covering through at breakneck speed. And Chatwin realizes it's because it's normally sung at walking pace, so he slows down the Land Rover and the man begins to sing his songs. And I have a developing theory that this is very similar to the Gallic landscape, but that's for another day.
And that is a fantastic point at which to end. Thank you. So thank you, Simon, Caroline and Rod, and congratulations again, Rod. Well done. And yes, and thank you, Frank. And thank you, everybody. That's it for our final panel discussion. Thank you all for coming along. It's really interesting, fascinating that three so different papers talk essentially about the same thing in many respects. And I think that's really interesting the way that kind of connected through. And so it's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Michael Rayner, our Dean of Research, who's going to kind of say a few closing remarks and make a wee announcement. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Ian. It's been a terrific conference, and I'm really pleased and grateful for being given the chance just to round off the event. But before I do, can I add my own congratulations to you, Rod? That's a terrific result in the achievement of your doctorate. I'm wondering if it's possible, when the presentation comes up, as hopefully it will, if somebody can let me know that it's arrived there safely and you can see it properly.
Yeah, we can see that.
That's fantastic. I'm really pleased about that. I was a bit worried a bit earlier, but you could say you're going perhaps from the sublime of the last session to the ridiculous of this one, but hopefully I'll do my best to do some justice and to take us perhaps on a little bit of a journey through what we've experienced in this conference. A wonderful set of presentations. We've been taken to places, concepts, experiences, human and other, that have been stimulating and also challenging at times. But I think that's what the choice of the title, The Edge, was really designed to achieve. So we've been taken to the edge of society, geography, space, time, emotion, and a range of other things too. And it has been a wonderful and stimulating and exciting journey, a real triumph. On day one, As you'll recall, we started with an introduction from the university principal, Professor Todd Walker, who celebrated the importance and significance of research in the arts, humanities and social sciences, noting that without these, we run the risk of being a far less tolerant society. Then we learned that we're held together by dirt in a presentation from Mike Pearson, very ably delivered by Leslie Mickle on his behalf. It felt to be a little bit like a grown-up version of Blue Peter in terms of coming up with something really ingenious out of something, in fact, out of very little at all. But in this case, with a real important objective of surviving at the edge. Then we looked at islands at the edge of modernity, picturing the Western Isles with 3 fascinating presentations through the medium of photography in connection with the island communities and periods of historic transition. And that was with Andrew, Peter and Matt. After this, we discovered that we were connected by the sea and cosmology when thinking about Rapa Nui with Colin Richards and the puzzle of the gaze of the Moai inland, before moving on to look at community coastal rowing with Mary Todd, with its link to health and well-being for individuals and communities. We then went on to look at the themes of drawing, print and temporal edges with Callie, Gina and Sandra. And we even went to the movies in a form under the heading Watermarks, followed by a look with Jack at theatrical responses to the Arctic in its post-Soviet context, focusing on Pyramidion in Svalbard. And then Lindsay Blair's fascinating presentation, ringnet fishing and the word image collaborations of Angus Martin and Will McLean. And we ended the day at the edge of sound with an exciting sing-along, in a sense, with whales and geese, with choir masters Emily, Alex, Catherine and Leslie. It was an extraordinary and thought-provoking way to end the day. On day 2, we picked up where we'd left off with a great keynote on folk and folklore from Margaret Bennett, an inspiring and deeply personal story and reflection. And I read in the comments somewhere that somebody used a wonderful phrase saying that the presentation was transformative. We considered issues of community and place with 3 really interesting perspectives and contexts for this from Wilma, Frank and Crocher. We've also seen the launch of a new network at this conference, Clan, which Bobby introduced to us all. And then we moved to Hillthorpe Boundaries as monumentalizing the edge, presented by Niall, where we learned about settlements in Bronze and Iron Age Britain. We had a look at liminal and contested spaces, including no less a visit to a round table led by Mandy, while Rebecca led us through an underpass, and Vicky caused us to reflect on the challenges faced by the young and vulnerable in marginalised communities and contexts. The events of the conference were concluded by a look at various edge effects and borderlands, as we've just heard, both in marine and land-based contexts, with presentations from Simon, Caroline and Rod. In short, we've covered a huge amount of ground and topics, and the experience of all of this has been fascinating and enlightening. I have to say that when I started to think myself about the meaning of the phrase, the edge, and its huge number of possible interpretations, my own mind set off on its own peculiar journey. And it took me to all sorts of curious places. The point is, when we make use of a sort of term like the edge, we all sort of understand what it means each time. And yet each time it is used, it can actually mean something completely different. It has near limitless elasticity in its usage and interpretation. Just think about a few examples, often polar opposites of each other, but captured by the same core phrase. So what does it mean, for example, to be on the edge of your seat? Danger, expectation, heart-stopping excitement, menace, promise, moving into the unknown. Indeed, the phrase has both positive overtones and negative undercurrents. It can mean being poised for a new adventure or being close to the limit of personal tolerance. We can be at the edge of space, delving into the unknown, or at the water's edge, with the peace and tranquility it can bring, as well as the raw and unpredictable power of the sea resting in the apparent calm. We can talk about people we might call edgy, which brings a sense of menace and sometimes excitement too. And we can also talk about the things that unite us, while at the same time dividing us in our various geographies and the cultures captured within them, each of which border with each other or the sea in both a fixed but also a constantly changing relationship. It has to be said that COVID-19 has brought many of us close to the edge in one sense or another, and not usually very positively. But on the other hand, the wonders of art and design, drama, literature, scientific discovery, and so on, can bring us close to the edge of excitement and engagement in a much more positive and reflective way. But what can force us over the edge or beyond it? On the positive side, to celebrate and move into the fullness of something, or towards the point of defeat in a more negative context? Well, in my own original discipline of theology, there was a famous debate that was somewhat connected to the concept of the edge. Some of you may know this. This time in respect of the ability of reality and reason to take one to the edge of faith. This was a key part of a philosophical and theological debate embodied by two protagonists, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing and Søren Kierkegaard, in their consideration of what has become known as the big, broad, ugly ditch. The proposition by Lessing is that reason and perceived reality can take someone, in effect, to the edge of a chasm, a big, broad, ugly ditch, the other side of which is faith, but it cannot take them beyond the edge. In response, and in despite of the fear of the unknown, the chasm has to be bridged by taking a final leap of faith, which is where Kierkegaard came in effect, to move beyond the boundary and limitation of the edge and into something new, a new level of understanding, a new relationship to something or someone, and so on. I wonder how many of us who have children feel pushed to the edge on not infrequent occasions. Unbelievably, my own kids say that I managed to evoke the same sort of feelings in them, and unbelievable, I can hear you say. I thought that too. But how many of us in our academic field still get a real buzz from a new discovery, which takes us beyond our former limit of knowledge and opens up a whole new world of possibilities? Humanity was once limited to the surface of the Earth and then to the edge of space, but now we're exploring the outer reaches of our galaxy and beyond. And we speak of things not in terms of miles per hour, but the speed of light, and even faster, the speed of thought. So the question is, where truly is the edge? I'd like to take this opportunity then to conclude what has been a truly excellent conference by offering a few thanks on your behalf, if I may, to the organisers, Leslie Mickle, Raggy Lushland, Ian Robertson and Joe Rogers in particular, but together with Colin Richards, Crochura Gillihan and Lindsay Blair. I'd like to thank the presenters, but in particular our keynotes, Margaret Bennett, Mike Pearson in the guise of Leslie Mickle, and Niall Sharples. I'd like to thank the supporting team, Rory Stewart and Leanne McLeod from UHI's technical support team, and Jill McNichol from the events team. And I'd really like to thank everybody who has been here as attendees and participants for all your wonderful contributions. Now, as we draw near to the edge of 2021, I'd also like to wish you a very happy break and festive season ahead. and then beyond that, a good end to what has been a truly challenging year, and into 2022 with a sense of hope and promise for the next part of our journeys together, hopefully pushing the boundaries in all sorts of new and interesting ways. Then, in 2022, we can look forward to engaging our thoughts with the HARC and Silk theme for that year, which has the equally provocative and stimulating title, Enchantment and Wonder. In a description of the theme, which will involve a range of events and activities across 2022, it says, enchantment and wonder mesh wonderfully with current perspectives on the material world. Consequently, places, sites, and modes of enchantment and wonder have now made a welcome appearance in research programs in a broad range of disciplines, including anthropology, art, archaeology, drama, heritage, history, literature, and psychology. The experience of enchantment and wonder is part of being human and, as Jane Bennett reminded us, in danger of erosion in today's world. In this UHI research theme for 2022, we wish to celebrate and explore enchantment and wonder in all its manifestations. So, put your thinking caps on as to how you might engage with next year's theme. And therefore, as you sail off into the sunset, don't tip off the edge, but please do move forward with us into a new adventure of enchantment and wonder. See you next year, and thank you very much indeed.